How can newsrooms frame stories in a way that offer people the news they need rather than emphasize political infighting or even write headlines that focus on the solutions to the problems?
So I return to this piece by the Solutions Journalism Network over and over and over again, and it's around complicating the narrative. And this is looking at the way that we write stories and who we quote and how we tell those things. And that in these really polarized times, our tendency is to seek simplicity and order, that we're all sort of panicked. And we do it in our writing, we do it in our relationships. But when we can actually complicate and bring nuance to the stories that we're telling, that's where people can actually open up a little bit more of that curiosity. And in this same article, they talk about literally the way our brain works when we feel like we're under threat. And the piece of our brain needed to take in new information and to be curious doesn't actually work at all when it feels like it's under threat, which I think it's not typically something we think about in journalism. And I think as journalists, we tend, whether it goes against some of our metrics for success to not be super transparent in our methods, to write those headlines that may be dramatic that will get people to click. But it's thinking about, who are we alienating when we write something in a certain way, whether it's as simple as a headline. And I think it's coming from this place of humility, that we aren't the gatekeepers of information anymore. We are the people who have the time to go and investigate concerns of people. And it's our job to come back and paint a realistic picture. And so we spend a lot of time at Spaceship figuring out, how do we talk across those differences, and how do we not alienate people, and how we as a news organization, do we bring people together? So it's not just with our articles or our videos, but how are we actually creating spaces where our community can come together and have civil conversations? And then what are the stories that come out of that we could focus on? And I think one other piece that I really have taken from, more solutions based is figure out where it's working and who's doing that work on the ground. So covering sort of difficult, divisive, wicked problems, as they say, through the lens of where are people actually doing something that's working, and how can we focus on that, and not, trying to make it rainbows and unicorns, but this is a way to look at this so that people read an article and say, like, okay, homelessness in New York City and, in the NYCHA housing complexes, that's a huge problem. But rather than, leaving someone with just this completely deflated feeling, it's very different when you cover that through, the organization of moms who are fighting on the ground to get housing for people in their neighborhood, and creating neighborhood associations. And maybe that's really small, but you're seeing those bits of change work. And I think it's how we choose to cover things, and not just sort of going straight to the drama that makes a good story. I think it's, figuring out where there's more nuance.
Oh my goodness. So many things. Erica, yes, all of that. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Solutions Journalism Network, because they are just so excellent, such excellent partners. I'm so thankful for the work that they're doing. When, that this question of framing in a way that meets needs and isn't kind of isolating. I think it starts with one of those questions we were asking before of the relationship. You have to figure out who needs what. So I think about an issue like homelessness, for example, and the information and the news that folks who are maybe living in a tent city need is different than the news and information than people who are organizing around that issue and advocating for that issue. And that news is even different from people who don't have to drive by or interact with the tent city on a regular basis. And those are different stories. And so those stories all need to be told. because we need each of those folks to be able to be in their power with their people, with their communities, to try to create shift and try to create something better. And so I think as much as this piece around polarization and isolation is around who newsrooms and journalists are in relationship with, it's also about facilitating relationships amongst a community and amongst a network and an ecosystem that exists around any political issue, any communal issue, any safety, wellness issue. That there's always an ecosystem there. And those people are always connected. So even the folks who are as like anti an issue and the folks who are most for an issue, if you map out those relationships, at some point they connect. And so figuring out how to facilitate those relationships is really key. I think that the other piece that comes up is, and I think this is one of there's this really terrible cycle that exists, right? And I talked a little bit before about how journalism and other kind of culture creating, culture shifting industries and sectors create culture and create the policy floor where the forest floor where policy happens. But the other thing is that I think we've gotten so used to policy that is based in concession and based in scarcity. And so there is a culture that is spread out from all of that. And I'll have to thank the folks. There's this really incredible organization, Liberation Ventures, who I have to thank for their thought partnership in this, because this was not at all me just sitting around by myself. But it was being in conversation with them that helped me realize that when our policies and our governance is concession based, it creates polarization, because it creates this mindset and this culture where we don't all get and we can't all get what we deserve to live and what we need to live. When in reality, we have the resources, we have the technology, we have the brilliance, we have the innovation to have all of our needs met. And we have the things we need. And so I think if we want policy, if we want governance, if we want culture, if we want society that works from this framework and this understanding that we can and deserve to have our needs met and we deserve to be well, then we also need to create journalism and write stories and work with communities and tell the stories that create that culture. What is the journalism that tells the story that all these needs can be met? We may not have figured it out yet. We may have to do some different configurations of thought partnering, of research and design, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. It just means that we haven't done it yet.
Oh, thank you so much, Alicia. That is really, I just love that. I just love all of that. I'm going to address my answer to the journalists who I hope are going to ultimately be listening to this, who might be sitting there saying, okay, this is all well and good, but news focuses on conflict because conflict is newsworthy. And I remember, early in my career, people calling the newspaper and saying, back when people used the telephone for something like calling and saying, why don't you ever do some good news? That's not really what we're talking about here. I mean, yes, we want to do good news, but that's not really what we're talking about. What we're talking about is how you're framing stories that even are bad news. So, for example, research clearly shows that when news stories focus on the fight and not the issue, that it has bad ramifications. So in other words, if the news story focuses on the conflict between, say, the Democrats and Republicans about a particular issue versus the issue itself, it makes people think that our society is more polarized than it is. And it is pretty polarized, but they think it's even worse. And why is that bad? Because it makes people disengage. It makes them say, why bother? Everything's a mess. They all are awful. Why should I get involved in this if there's no hope? It also, and this alludes to what Erica was saying earlier about the solutions journalism, it also is emotionally and mentally exhausting, right? Your brain shuts off when you're under crisis. I think that is a really good thing to keep in mind. And when people are exhausted, they're not learning from us. And that's a problem. They're looking at a spectacle. Now, they may be entertained, And they may share those stories, right? In the same way that people will rubberneck at a car accident, but that's not really what we want. And the other problem with it is when the news focuses on the fight and not the issue can get lost. And a good example of this is coronavirus. At the Center for Media Engagement, we have done some research on this. And, I first want to say lots of coverage of coronavirus has been wonderful and helpful. But we focused on local news coverage across the country that was shared on Facebook, and we compared it to surveys of what people wanted to know about the coronavirus at 3 points during the pandemic. And what we found was really startling was that the coverage focused on really the bad stuff of businesses closing and the economy collapsing. And what the public wanted was stuff more of what, like Erica was saying, news you can use. Like, how do I know if this thing is true about masks or about the vaccine or about how it spreads? And how is my grocery store responding? Where can I get toilet paper? Like, that's what the public wanted to know. And we call this gap the crisis coverage gap. But really what it is it's a failure of news organizations to serve their readers at a time when the stakes of not serving them are deadly. But that same kind of thing can play out with other issues, political stories. Immigration is a good example. If the stories focus only on the fact that one side is yelling these crazy things at the other side and doesn't focus on the issue, the bigger issue of immigration, what can get lost is why they're even arguing. Right? There's a lot of drama and it might get shared a lot, but people miss the point that there is an immigration issue in our country, that there is a big problem and that there's ways to solve it. So that's one thing I really want to underscore is we are not saying stop covering things that are bad, because obviously news is often bad. Like, we don't want you to just, we don't want, as Erica said, unicorns and rainbows. I mean, that's not what we're saying. But as you frame it, don't focus on the spectacle of the conflict to the exclusion of the issues, the underlying issues.
Wanted to say too, sort of speaking to those journalists, that for a lot of these things, it's not asking people to do a lot more work. Sometimes it's just shifting the focus. Obviously we have to cover conflict. We have to bring, amplify voices that are not getting heard. And that's usually when they're getting screwed over in some way. That is crucial to our job. But I think, if you do a big piece on immigration, for instance, you've done enough reporting to also write a couple of explainers that go at the bottom. If this is a specific issue that you're dealing with, here are the places that you can go. Here are some things that people have found that have been particularly helpful. Here's who we talked to for this piece. And I think, combining sort of larger, whether they're features or kind of these bigger pieces with news you can use, you've already done the reporting. And so it's just sort of packaging things differently, again, to sort of speak to this ecosystem. And if you're aware of all of the different people who this issue affects, then you write or you make something for each one of those parties. And also figuring out, again, how do you bring them together in some way so that the people living in the tent city are not the enemies of the people who drive by. And the activists are not just, lunatics who are working against a problem that will never be fixed.
Thanks, Erica. Alicia, did you have anything you wanted to follow up with?
Yeah, this conversation, kind of distilling it down into something that feels tangible for folks, it makes me think of two things, at least. The Equal Rights Amendment and crime coverage, which maybe don't seem related, but I'll tell you why they make me think of them. So there was recently this TV series, Miss America, that kind of was a covering of the Equal Rights Amendment. And the thing that came up in it, and one of the things that happened in real life when folks were organizing around the ERA, was that some of the opposition to the ERA was women who wanted to be housewives and homemakers and felt like their livelihoods were at risk because of the ERA. And folks use that, right? That was political capital that people used to get votes against and for things, and used to move into other issues. At the same time, though, around the same time, not the exact same time, there was also a movement that was happening, and some activism that was going on under this campaign of wages for housework. The Wages for Housework campaign was like perceived as this like radical leftist campaign. And it was women, it was homekeepers, homemakers who were like, this is labor and I need to get paid for it because this is real work. And so one of the things my partner and I we were watching this, and we were talking about that, and we were like, but what if like there was someone who was able to bring these things together and say like, you want to be a housewife, you want wages for housework, like these are the same thing actually. But instead what happened was, because of like bad players, that never happened. And there were no stories that came out to say like, what is the connection between these folks? What are the similar things that folks want out of this? And instead, it became people kind of fighting against each other's livelihoods. I think about that a lot because that just comes up so often, where there is this political spectrum, and that at some point in different places in it bows towards each other. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunity when those bows happen, to say like, what are the things that are connective tissue here? Which does go back to that, like, how do we create and tell stories about everyone being able to have what they need and to be well? And then the other thing I mentioned was the crime reporting and crime coverage. I think about the work that Danielle Killian has done. And so she's this researcher and writer, and she's been doing work for a long time around police coverage and crime coverage. And one of the things that she talks about is that oftentimes crime coverage makes everyone unsafe, and it makes everyone feel unsafe, right? So it creates these narratives oftentimes where Black and brown folks are at risk of lack of safety, right? Because there is a perception, there are policing mechanisms that are created that target Black and brown folks that say like, you are the holders and the perpetuators of crime. But at the same time, it creates this fear and lack of safety amongst white folks who aren't Black and brown, to say like, these are the people to be scared of. And what that means is that when folks are running into each other and seeing each other, there's no community there. There's no perception of safety, because there are people who are at risk, and there are people who feel at risk. And all of that has to do with the same narrative. And it all has to do with the programs and policies that get created because of those narratives. And so much of her work is about, how do we create less fear? And how do we actually, that question earlier, how do we get people the news and information they need without creating the fear that divides and separates a community? And what that does is that it shifts the culture, it shifts the narrative, so that Black and brown folks don't have to be in fear of our lives. And it also creates a situation where white folks are not in fear of their lives because of Black and brown folks. And so thinking about how we transition and how we transform crime coverage, I think, is one of those instances. And it is one of the why we work in it. It's juicy, it's messy, it's a lot. But I do think it is one of those access points that has so much ability to shift how we perceive each other and how we build community into the future.